All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining our uh, author talk today. My name is Erica, and I'm with the Ventress Memorial Library, and we are excited to host Christopher Klein. Christopher Klein is the author of 4 books, including When the Irish Invaded Canada, The Incredible True Story of the Civil War Veterans Who Fought for Ireland's Freedom, and Strong Boy, The Life and Times of John L. Sullivan, America's First Sports Hero. A frequent contributor to History.com, the website of the History Channel, Christopher has also written for the Boston Globe, the New York Times, National Geographic Traveler, Harvard Magazine, Smithsonian.com, and AmericanHeritage.com. Without further ado, thank you so much, Christopher, for joining us.
Thanks, Erica, and thanks for everyone joining in too. So I'm here to tell you about the story of a band of Irish Americans who fled the Great Hunger, fought on both sides of the Civil War, and then united to undertake one of the most fantastical missions in military history, which was to hold Canada hostage and ransom it for Ireland's independence. So I know the story sounds like complete blarney, but I'm here to tell you that it actually happened, and not just one time, but 5 times between 1866 and 1871 in what are known as the Fenian Raids. So I know the story sounds deathly absurd to us today, but part of what I want to do is transport you back about 150 years and convince you that the story isn't as crazy as it sounds to us today. So, why would anyone want to attack sweet, peaceable, friendly Canada, a place where even when you get in a car accident with the bus, you'll get a polite sorry? Well, that's us viewing the past through the lens of today when the United States and Canada share the longest peaceable international boundary in the world. And things between the United States and Canada were not always so polite. And in the first American century, the United States had a border problem, but it was a northern one. And the border of Canada was frequented by counterfeiters and smugglers. And the whole idea of invading Canada is about as American as fireworks on the 4th of July for the first century of American history. So even before the Declaration of Independence is signed, the Continental Army goes due north to Canada. So just weeks after the battles at Lexington and Concord, and General Richard Montgomery goes due north through the Lake Champlain Valley and seizes Montreal. And outside Quebec City, he meets up with another group of the Continental Army that was led by Colonel Benedict Arnold before he turned for the Redcoats. And they suffered a terrible defeat on New Year's Eve, 1775, outside Quebec City. Americans come back to Canada during the War of 1812. Thomas Jefferson had wrote that the taking Canada was going to be a mere matter of marching. Well, it turned out that it wasn't. Americans suffered several defeats in Canada, and there are a number of towns that are burned on both sides of the border. And even before the British are burning the White House and parts of Washington, D.C., it's American forces who are torching the capital of Ontario, which at the time was called York, and we know it today as Toronto. And then afterwards, there are some farcical interactions with equally ridiculous names. There's the Pork and Beans War of 1838 between lumberjacks in New Brunswick and Maine who are fighting over the same logging rights. And my favorite is the Pig War of 1859, which occurred on the disputed island, San Juan Island, out in the Pacific Northwest, when a pig belonging to the Hudson's Bay Company in Canada's Hudson's Bay Company was rooting around in a garden owned by an American, and an American shot the pig dead. And let's just say that things spiraled out of control to the point that 500 American forces and 2,000 British forces are sent to the island in a somewhat tense standoff. Luckily, no shots were fired, and it was said that the worst combat that the troops ever endured was really the crushing boredom of staring at each other back across the battlefield that was never used. So the other important thing to remember about is that the flag flying over Canada in the 1860s is not the maple leaf that we know it today. It's this flag. It's the Union Jack. So Canada is a province of Great Britain, just as Ireland is at the time. And the Irish who would invade Canada, if you were going to use today's parlance, you would say that they were radicalized by their experience living under the British. So the luck of the Irish is not something you really want to have for about 700 years of world history, because the Irish had the poor fortune of being in the backyard of what becomes the world's most powerful empire. Things were particularly bad if you're an Irish Catholic living in Ireland in the 1700s under what were known as the penal laws. So if you were an Irish Catholic, you could not freely worship or vote or hold public office. You couldn't send your kids to a Catholic school or have a Catholic teacher come into your house. You weren't allowed to own any firearms or a horse that was worth more than 5 pounds. You were allowed to have one knife as long as it was chained to a table so that you couldn't use it against the local police. And even in death, your rights were restricted because you could not have a Catholic priest preside over a graveside ceremony. So for 700 years, the British are trying to extinguish Ireland's religion and its culture and its language. And then when the potato crop fails in the 1840s to 1850s, there are some Irish who think that the British are trying to exterminate them altogether. And what some refer to as the potato famine, the Irish will refer to as the Great Hunger, because at the same time that the potato crop fails, the British are still exporting wheat and barley and oats from Ireland to English port cities. And during the Great Hunger, there are 1 million Irish who will die. 2 million are going to flee the country to the United States and Canada, Great Britain, Australia, all over the world. And the population of Ireland still has not rebounded since the time of the Great Famine. So, Great Hunger. At that time, it was a population of over 8 million people. It went down to about 5 billion people at the end of the Great Hunger, and still has never recovered to the 8 billion figure. So, about many of those 2 million who are fleeing the country are going to end up in the United States. And the Irish who come to the United States are unlike any newcomers the country had ever seen. For one thing, they're really refugees as opposed to immigrants. They're not starving for American ideals as much as they are literally starving for food. Many of them are poor, they're sick when they arrive. About a quarter of them don't speak English, they speak the Irish language. But what really sets them apart is that they practice a foreign religion, Catholicism. So this is a country that was founded on Protestant ideas, and this is really the first large-scale Catholic immigration into the country. And it really leads to a backlash that occurs in the 1850s when a group known as the Know Nothings, who were members of the American Party, run on anti-Catholic, anti-immigration platforms, and they achieve a lot of electoral success in 1854, particularly here in Massachusetts, where they win every statewide office. They win all but 3 seats in the state house, and then they implement their program, which includes mandating the use of the Protestant Bible. They will launch raids, surprise inspections of rectories and nunneries. They will start to deport the Irish back to the British Isles, and they disband any Irish American militias. So to say that the Irish didn't assimilate easily into United States culture would be a vast understatement. And the English had long talked about the Irish problem. And of course, to the English, the real Irish problem was that the Irish weren't English, and they repelled any attempts that the English tried to implement to remake the Irish in their own image. There's a quote that's attributed to Winston Churchill that Churchill said that the British had always found the Irish a bit odd because they refused to be British. And the way that the Irish were able to maintain their identity through 700 years are going to do the same thing when they come to the United States and face the same discrimination. So much like a snake coiling itself, snake trying to protect itself, it's going to coil itself inward for protection. And the Irish will sort of cling together in church parishes and fraternal organizations like the Ancient Order of Hibernians. And then in 1858, they're going to start joining another new association called the Fenian Brotherhood. And that is an organization that was founded by these 2 men. On the left is James Stephens, and on the right is John O'Mahony. And both of these men were Irish revolutionaries who took part in the 1848 failed revolution that was known as the Young Ireland movement. And James Stephens is in a shootout with the local police during this revolution. and is shot and presumed dead. And he will play dead on the side of the road and actually will sort of take a page out of the Tom Sawyer playbook and actually will fake his own funeral. So he has an obituary notice that's printed in the local Kilkenny newspaper. His father will bury a coffin full of rocks in the local cemetery. And the English authorities all think that James Stephens is dead, but he's actually on the lam in the mountains of Ireland, where he will eventually, after a couple months, dress up in women's clothing, make an escape on a ship to England, manages to cross England. It's said to even spent a night right under Queen Victoria's nose, spending a night in a hotel across from Buckingham Palace before he escapes to safety in Paris. And there he will meet up with John O'Mahony, who also will flee Ireland after the failed revolution. And by the late 1850s, after the Great Hunger has ended, James Stephens thinks that it's time for Ireland to try to launch another revolution. And so in March of 1858, actually on St. Patrick's Day, in Dublin, he will found an organization called the Irish Revolutionary Brotherhood. And there's a through line from this group known as the IRB to modern day times to the group that we will know as the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. So a few months after James Stephens founds the IRB, John O'Mahony, who has sailed to the second largest Irish city in the world at that time, which was New York City, founds a sister organization called the Fenian Brotherhood. And this is the first transatlantic revolutionary organization that has been ever created. And the idea is that in America, with the freedoms that America provides, John O'Mahony and the Fenian Brotherhood is going to raise money, purchase weapons, and they are going to ship them overseas to James Stephens, who will put together the armies to launch another revolution within Ireland. And that is their working plan. Now, members of the Fenian Brotherhood in the early years were required to take a sworn oath. This was a secret oath-based organization. And this is one of the membership oaths that they would have to sign. And because this is supposed to be a secret organization, the Fenian Brotherhood actually runs afoul of the Catholic Church. It will never be in its good graces, and eventually the Pope will issue a decree that any members of the Fenian Brotherhood will be excommunicated from the Catholic Church. And this is even years after the Fenian Brotherhood will stop being a secret association. And the greatest irony of this, as we will see later, is that the one thing that the Fenians could not do is keep a secret. They would freely use their Irish gift of gab, and it would get them into trouble time and again. So the plan is instead to plan for this next revolution in Ireland, and then the Civil War breaks out. And this plan has to go on hold at the time. And there's an Irish scholar by the name of Damien Shields who's done a lot of research into the participation of the Irish in the Civil War. And this amazed me. What he had found is that according to his research, about 200,000 native-born Irish are going to fight in the Civil War. About 175,000 from the Union, 25,000 for the Confederacy. Really, the side that the Irish fought on was a matter of geography, just where they happened to have landed and stayed when they came to America. And for those Irish who were fighting in the Union Army, they're really not enlisting to try to banish slavery. They are signing up in large numbers, partly due to the fact that it's a paid job. They are still at the lowest rung of the economic ladder. They don't think the war is going to last that long. They figure they'll sign up, enlist for their 3 months, get a check. It may be dangerous work, but it's better than no work at all. And then afterwards, they will go on and carry their lives. Now, of course, the war is going to last longer than any of them thought. The Irish are going to pay a particularly heavy price. They're going to die by the tens of thousands in some of the seminal battles in the Civil War, going from Bull Run to Gettysburg. But for some of the Fenians who enlist, they actually think that the Civil War is going to be good training for them for the war that they really want to fight, which is going to be this revolution in Ireland. So they figure that let's enlist, we'll learn something about battlefield tactics and weaponry, and then they'll go ahead and be able to use that back home in Ireland. And as the war progresses, the Fenian Brotherhood will actually send recruiters out to these camps, and there'll be groups of Fenians that form in the armies of the Potomac and the Cumberland. And by 1863, members of the Fenian Brotherhood are actually given passes that they are able to leave the front lines and travel to Chicago for the first Fenian convention. So by the end of the Civil War, there's probably there's tens of thousands of Fenian members. And then the group really swells over the next year or so. So the Fenian Brotherhood will start sending out recruiters who will go to the mill cities of New England. They'll go to the mining towns in Appalachia, and they'll go on these whistle stop tours where they'll go from town to town, and each night they'll have a fundraiser where there's Irish music and lectures and a recruiting drive by the Fenian Brotherhood. And women too would join a group called the Fenian Sisterhood, and they would have a bake sale, all to raise money to purchase weapons that they will ship back to Ireland. So by early 1866, the Fenian Brotherhood is a pretty formidable organization. And it even has its own Capitol building right in the heart of New York City, which is this 4-story brownstone that was known as the Moffett Mansion. And it was on the north side of Union Square. It's flying both the Stars and Stripes and an Irish flag above it. And it's operating perfectly out in the open. This is no longer any sort of secret society, but even still, it is banned by the Catholic Church. So the Fenian Brotherhood has its own capital, has its own president, its own constitution, has its own Secretary of War. It's basically an Irish republic in exile operating within the United States. And they are issuing war bonds, the denominations between $10 and $500. And the Irish would buy these war bonds, and these would then be payable 6 months after the establishment of the Irish Republic with interest. And there's an interesting side note to this, that when the Irish Republic is actually established decades later, in 1920s, all of a sudden, all these bonds start coming out of the woodwork from people who had them in the United States looking to get paid off. And the Irish government had no idea where these bonds came with, and did not allow them to be redeemed. But you can go on eBay today and see that they probably can still get a pretty good return for the investment if they were bought originally back in 1866. So the plans in place after the Civil War to have this revolution in Ireland. And then in the fall of 1865, the British will crack down on the Irish Republican Brotherhood. They will round up all the leaders of the IRB in Dublin. James Stephens actually will escape and goes on the lam. The whole idea of being able to launch a revolution in Ireland is sort of a dead idea at that time. But it's happening at the same time that there's a rising attitude among the Fenians that they should abandon this whole idea of having this revolution in Ireland, because they think it's kind of crazy to be able to raise these weapons and ship them to Ireland when they don't even have a single ship, let alone a navy. And they're really skeptical about how this original plan is going to work. They think a much better idea is going to be to strike the British right where they're closest to America, and that's going to be up in Canada, where if you were a member of the Fenian Brotherhood in Massachusetts, you could get on the train and be take an overnight train and be right at the step foot onto British territory the following morning. So this group really becomes in the ascendancy, and the change of plans happens from trying to have a revolution in Ireland to having this attack on Canada. So what are they hoping to do with the attack on Canada? Well, one idea is that maybe what they might be able to do is if they can divert enough British troops from Ireland to Canada, maybe then a revolution in Ireland would be feasible. Others think that if they can just gain a piece of territory, then they could launch out privateers out on the ocean that can disrupt all sorts of British shipping. Probably their most likely scenario here, though, is what they can do is spark a war between the United States and Great Britain. And I'll explain more about that in a minute, why that would be likely at that time. And what they would hope would be that maybe in exchange for helping the United States conquer Canada and become part of the United States in return would demand that the British grant Ireland its independence. And then there are some Fenians who, much like Thomas Jefferson a half century earlier, think that the taking of Canada will just be a mere matter of marching, that as soon as they get into Canada, they'll get the support of the 175,000 or so Irish who are living in Canada, all the French speakers in Quebec, and that they will be able to overtake Canada and literally hold it hostage and ransom it for Ireland's independence. So what's surprising to me in doing the research is that this idea actually had the tacit support of the United States government. And the United States government knew that they were selling excess Civil War supplies to the Fenian Brotherhood. And then there's a meeting that happens in the White House in the fall of 1865 between Fenian leaders and Andrew Johnson, President of the United States, and Secretary of State William Seward. And according to the Fenians, and they're the only source we have, so we do have to take that into account, they float this idea by President Johnson of what exactly would he think if they attacked Canada, and would the United States be interested in helping them at all? And Johnson tells them that he will, quote, acknowledge accomplished facts, meaning that, well, he's not going to do anything to actively support the Irish in their invasion of Canada. He's not going to do anything to stand in their way either. So if he wakes up one morning and the Irish are in Canada, then maybe he'll deal with it at that point, but he's not going to do anything to stand in their way. Now, why would the President of the United States take this position when it's against American law for any private army to attack a country with which the United States is at peace? Well, that's because of the tremendous animosity that is present in the United States at the end of the Civil War towards Great Britain. And that has to do with Great Britain's neutrality during the Civil War, which worked out to basically a tacit approval of the Confederacy. Now, you might remember the incident known as the Trent Affair that happened early in the Civil War when the United States and Great Britain almost got into a military conflict after the Americans stopped a British ship and took off two Confederate diplomats who were on their way to Great Britain. But what really irks the Americans is that Confederate warships were being built in British ports. And not only that, there were reports that British crews were manning some of these Confederate warships as well, even to the point of faking Southern accents when they were on board. And these Confederate warships were not just in battle against the Union, but they were disrupting Union trade all around the world, including this ship here, which was the CSS Alabama, which did millions of dollars of damage in disrupting American trade. So at the end of the war, President Johnson is seeking reparations from Great Britain for all this damage. He wants the British government to pay millions and millions of dollars to the United States government. And then there's a lot of animosity towards Canada itself at the end of the Civil War. And that's because Canada was not just a place that draft dodgers would go to and escape Confederate prisoners of war, but there was also a cell of the Confederate Secret Service that was operating inside Canada. And this Secret Service cell they plotted the raid on the banks in St. Albans, Vermont, in which the Confederacy was able to get tens of thousands of dollars. They plotted a firebombing of public spaces and theaters in New York City that they carried out in 1864, which luckily they tried to firebombing some of these public spaces and theaters, and fortunately did not work as planned. And then there's a thought that they were out also behind the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, because reportedly John Wilkes Booth was seen walking the streets of Montreal days before the assassination. And after he was killed, there were also reports that they found a note from the Royal Ontario Bank in one of his pockets. So you have all this animosity towards Great Britain and towards Canada, and it's happening at the same time that America still has this belief in its manifest destiny. So after the Mexican-American War, which allowed the United States to from New York to California, it's integrated the Southwest, it's now reunited with the South. The next logical place for the United States to expand is going to be due north in Canada. So in doing my research, I found that there was actually a bill that was introduced in Congress in 1865 that laid out where exactly the 4 new states were going to come, when it was just assumed that Canada was going to become a part of the United States, and they portioned out where 29 new congressmen were going to be allotted. And then there's also this interesting plan that was floated by a senator from Michigan named Zach Chandler that was co-signed by dozens of senators. And his idea was that as a way to heal the country after the Civil War, that the United States would put together a 200,000 person army with 100,000 men from the north and 100,000 men from the south. And what they would do was going to invade Canada, and they were going to hold Canada until the British paid what were called the Alabama claims, those reparations. So in essence, it's pretty much the same plan that the Fenians are going in with. We're going to invade Canada, we're going to hold a hostage until we get what we want. So rather than risking any American forces, it's pretty acceptable for the White House to more or less outsource the job to the immigrants to do. So with this tacit White House approval, the plan is put together to attack Canada, and it's the brainchild of this man, Thomas William Sweeney, who to me is the epitome of the fighting Irish. So Sweeney will leave Ireland when he's a young boy, and on his journey to America, he's swept overboard and manages to survive about 30 minutes in the cold Atlantic before he's finally rescued. He will enlist in the Union Army, fights in the Mexican-American War. He's in a battle where he takes one gunshot but keeps on fighting, and then another one a few minutes later will pierce his right arm and require its amputation. He stays in the Union Army, however, and actually will get into a fist fight with one of his superior officers and whips him with his one good arm. He'll fight in the Civil War and manages to be one of the heroes at the Battle of Shiloh, even though he takes a gunshot to the leg, 2 gunshots to his one remaining arm. And so at the end of the Civil War, here's a man who's given 20 years and 1 arm to the cause of the United States. But after the Civil War, he actually will leave the Union Army, joins the Fenian Brotherhood to become the Secretary of War. And that's how much regard he still had for his homeland after spending 20 years in the United States. So this is the plan that Sweeney will put together and to attack Canada. And it's a 5-point plan. It's an amphibious invasion. And it will include an attack from the west, from Chicago all the way over to Lake Champlain. So he's planning a water invasion over the Great Lakes, Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland and Buffalo. And he's going to have these armies march on Toronto. But this is all just a giant feint, because his real goal is to send 17,000 men right up through the Lake Champlain Valley to seize Montreal, seize Quebec City, and then that way the Fenians are going to have a chokehold on the St. Lawrence River, which is really the economic lifeblood of Canada. So it's this 5-pronged invasion that he puts together. And it's a plan that sounds great to this fellow here, whose name is John O'Neill. And John O'Neill was another Irish immigrant born in the north of Ireland on what is today the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And he grew up, he saw the Great Hunger devastate his town, where a quarter of the people died during the Great Hunger. And he also heard great stories of members of the O'Neill clan from his grandfather. So he heard tales of ancestors such as Hugh O'Neill and Owen Roe O'Neill, who were famous for not defeating the British, but just for standing up and trying to fight against them. His ancestors had fought against the forces of Queen Elizabeth I. And so John O'Neill knows that the luck is usually against the Irish, but there was no glory in doing nothing. So he becomes a member of the Fenian Brotherhood after fighting in the Civil War, where he too also takes a gunshot. And so when in May of 1866, Sweeney will send out telegrams to members of the Fenian Brotherhood to come to the war front, come north. And with receiving the telegram, John O'Neill will leave his wife and 6-month-old son and his business in Nashville, board a train with a few dozen of his fellow Fenians, where he will go to the war front up north. And he is under orders to then leave Cleveland and join that invasion into Ontario. But when John O'Neill gets to Cleveland, he's finding out what Sweeney is finding out, and that is that the idea of attacking Canada is starting to fall apart even before it can begin. The boats that the Fenians expected in Chicago aren't there. In Cleveland, they don't have the commanders. They're finding all of a sudden that their moves are being tracked. And as I said, the Irish had a pretty good use of the gift of gab. So all their movements are front page news all over the country. So there's really not much of an element of surprise going on. The Fenians have been infiltrated by British spies and Canadian spies and American spies who really know every move that they are making. So Sweeney has to adjust his war plan on the fly. So what he does is that he sends O'Neill all the men he can find to Buffalo. And he wants them to just get across into Canada. He figures as soon as the Fenians are on Canadian soil, then they're going to get thousands and thousands of other Fenians and Irish following behind them. They're going to get all the support of the Irish in Canada, and they'll be fine just as soon as they get onto Canadian soil. So on the night of May 31st, 1866, John O'Neill is in Buffalo with about 800 Fenians. And John O'Neill happens to be the right man in the right place at the right time, because he is the highest ranking officer that can be found inside the Fenian Brotherhood. So he is given the duty to command the forces to lead the invasion in Canada. And for O'Neill, it's like his whole life has led to this moment. Here's another O'Neill taking up arms against the British to try to achieve glory. And he wrote that the governing passion of my life, apart from my duty to my God, is to be at the head of an Irish army battling against England for Ireland's rights. For this I live, and for this I am willing to die if necessary. So on the night of May 31st, 1866, the Fenians, who were holed up in the Irish First Ward neighborhood, come out late in the evening, wagons worth of ammunition and guns that they had smuggled into the city. They were pulling on wagons. And word gets down to the dock in Buffalo to an American warship, the USS Michigan. And it is, the Fenians know that the only thing that is standing between them and the Canadian territory is this American warship, the USS Michigan. There are no Canadian forces who are ready on the other side. That is because the Canadians expected an attack was coming on St. Patrick's Day in 1866. So they had called all their militias out to the border, and then nothing happened. So they were afraid to do it again. It was sort of like the boy who cried wolf. They're really leery of sending forces out again, and more or less figure that they don't really think an attack's going to happen. They'll deal with it does. So it's really this one American warship that the Fenians have to worry about. So, so when the Fenians are on their march through Buffalo, word gets to the commander of the ship, Captain Andrew Bryson, to launch his ship in the water. Now, what Bryson doesn't know is that there's actually a sleeper cell of Fenians on this warship. 17 Fenians are among his sailors. And they know that that ship is not going anywhere without its pilot, whose name is Patrick Murphy. But do not let the name fool you. Patrick Murphy was a loyal sailor. He was a member of the British Navy before he became a member of the American Navy. And the Fenians know that he's going to follow any order that he's going to be given. So they know that the only way to sabotage the USS Michigan is to take Patrick Murphy out. And I don't mean that they are going to kill him. They literally are going to take him out for a night on the town in Buffalo. So when Captain Andrew Bryson is looking for Patrick Murphy to launch the USS Michigan, Patrick Murphy is on his 5th or 6th drink of the night, supposedly stumbling down the streets of Buffalo, singing The Wearing of the Green, and the USS Michigan is forced to stay in port. So with the coast clear, John O'Neill and his 800 men cross the Niagara River. They plant an Irish flag onto British territory, and they start the first Fenian invasion of Canada. And it's going to be a full 24 hours before they encounter any Canadian Defense Forces. So on this map here, you'll see that the Fenian movements are marked out by these blue arrows, and the British by the green one, the British and the Canadians by the red ones on this map. And it's not until the morning of June 2nd, 1866, John O'Neill is outside the village of Ridgeway, which is about 20 miles due south of Niagara Falls, about 8 miles west of Buffalo. And John O'Neill is on this limestone ridge outside the village of Ridgeway, and he can see an army that's coming at him that's about 3 times the size of his forces. Now, John O'Neill's army is a ragtag group in that it's got men who were fighting with the Confederacy and men who were fighting with the Union. Some of them were in their Confederate grays who have come as far away as New Orleans. They were members of the Louisiana Tigers. You have some who are dressed in their Union blues. And here they are now going to war, fighting side by side. So even though he's outnumbered, he has a very experienced force who have been battle hardened during the Civil War. So the Canadian Defense Forces that are coming at him are, by contrast, not battle tested at all. Many of them were farmers who never fired a gun in their lives. There's a regiment that was made up of professors and students from the University of Toronto. You had young men who were in their dorm rooms the night before the invasion who were studying for their finals, who got a knock on the door and said, well, good news, you don't have to study for your finals anymore. Bad news is we need you at the drill shed in downtown Toronto at 4 a.m. where you're going to be given a gun to go off to the southern border to fight off the invaders. So these two forces are going to clash on the morning of June 2nd outside the village of Ridgeway. And with their superior numbers, the Canadian Defense Forces get the better part of the battle at the beginning. And let's see if, so this is the classical depiction of the Battle of Ridgeway. And I can tell you there's very little here that is actually historically accurate. So for one thing, these men were not fighting in a field in these lines like you would see if you're going to the reenactments of the, you know, on Lexington Green or any of the battles that happened in Concord. They were fighting actually inside an apple orchard. It's very much more of a chaotic scene. And then let's talk about what they're wearing here. So Canadian forces are not wearing, they're not dressed up like redcoats. The Irish are not dressed up in all green uniforms. As I said, you'll see Confederate grays and Union blues, some in civilian clothing. When the Fenians go back in 1870, they will be dressed all in green, and they will be carrying a banner that says IRA, because they were referring to themselves as the Irish Republican Army, but not this Battle of Ridgeway. We do have an eyewitness account here. This is more what it looked like. Fought through orchards, over split rail fences. These men in green that you see here, those are the Canadian Defense Forces. They're not the Fenians. So they're pressing the fight with their superior numbers. And then John O'Neill will do what he can do only with an experienced force, is that he fakes a retreat with his forces. The Canadians will overextend their lines. And then just at the right moment, John O'Neill comes over the ridge on top of a horse and gives the order for his men to charge. And it completely turns the tide of the battle. And the inexperienced Canadian commander sees John O'Neill on a horse, thinks a cavalry charge is coming. So he puts his men into a square formation, which is a textbook formation to repel a cavalry charge. However, that's not what they're facing. And the men are more or less sitting ducks, and within minutes, they are running for their lives from the battlefield. And it is a deadly battle. There's about 20 men who are killed on both sides. There are a handful of Canadians, casualties are included, members of that class of the University of Toronto. So you have young boys who are dying on the battlefield. But this is a great victory for the Irish, and John O'Neill will forever be known as the hero of Ridgeway. So he's got this victory, but John O'Neill's figuring out, well, where are the reinforcements coming from America? Where are the Canadians who were going to join with him? So O'Neill, after the Battle of Ridgeway, circles back to his landing point, and there's another gun battle through the streets of the town of Fort Erie, where again the Irish are victorious. But what John O'Neill sees when he gets to Fort Erie is that the USS Michigan has finally gone out in the Niagara River along with other American warships, and their supply lines are completely cut. So John O'Neill knows that he can't go forward. If there are not going to be any more men coming behind him and no more supplies, he's not going to be able to continue the fight. So he has to make the reluctant decision to retreat back to America. So on their way back to America, Bryson is going to end up arresting all 800 of the Fenians who went into Canada. For a couple of days, they are kept on this barge that is attached to the back of the warship until they are waiting what Andrew Johnston wants to do with them. Johnston, after a couple of days of dawdling, decides that he's going to let all the rank and file go. In fact, the War Department's going to pay for their train fare just for them to go back to their homes. John O'Neill and the other leaders are arrested and face charges in Buffalo. They are defended by a local lawyer from Buffalo named Grover Cleveland, who will become president of the United States. They are let out on bail, and they are eventually charges are going to be dropped against them. So all this action, I've taken all about 100 pages through the book. There are many more forays to come. John O'Neill, before he will leave Canadian soil, however, he will take all the prisoners that the Fenians have captured, line them up one by one. Canadians think that they're about to face a firing squad and be killed on the spot, but instead John O'Neill goes down the line, shakes each man's hand one by one, pledges that he's going to come back to Canada with a much larger army. And John O'Neill is going to be true to his word. Again, in 1870 and 1871, he will return to Canada, sometimes with increasingly farcical results. So I will give you this spoiler alert, however, that the idea of attacking Canada and then holding it hostage and ransoming it for Ireland's independence did not work. So what is the legacy then of the Fenian Brotherhoods? Well, I think there's three of them. One is that the Fenians will actually bring home rule to one part of the British Empire, but it's not the one they intended. In the months after the attack on Canada in 1866, there's fresh impetus for what is called the Confederation movement, where Canada will have its own federal parliament. And Canadians are not happy at all with the inability of the British government to defend them, so they want more home rule. So on July 1st, 1867, the Confederation of Canada occurs. The first parliament is seated in Ottawa, and Ottawa is chosen as the location, even though it's this backwater lumber town, but it was considered to be far enough away from the American border because there have just been so many invasions from the United States. Canada needed a safer place for its capital than in larger cities like Toronto and Montreal. So, second legacy is that this transatlantic partnership that the Irish had put in place would be used successfully in 1916 during the Easter Rising. So, with money and weapons that were raised in America and shipped to Ireland, the Easter Rising would eventually be successful and give rise to the Irish Free State. And it's no small, it's not a coincidence that in the Irish Proclamation that's read out in 1916, very prominent mention is given to Ireland's exiles in America and the role that they played in supporting the revolution. So, and that organization that James Stephens founded in 1858, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, that's the same organization that is behind the Easter Rising in 1916. And as I said, will continue on through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s in Northern Ireland as the IRA. And then I think the other takeaway is that the Fenians sort of keep alive this torch of revolution from the Young Ireland generation in 1848 and are able to pass it along to the Easter Rising generation in 1916. And without them doing so, maybe Irish independence happens a lot later than it does. Maybe it doesn't happen at all. And I think it's a lesson that these Irish Americans were still willing to put in the fight, even though that the odds were long, odds were against them, likely weren't going to see the success of their labors in their lifetime, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't worth putting up a fight. So I think it's a lesson, in areas such as civil rights or even the fight against cancer, even though you may not see the ultimate victory in your lifetime, doesn't mean that it's not important to put up that fight so that others can also learn, can also benefit generations down the line. And I think that's sort of the story of the Fenians as well. So I think with that, I'm going to stop sharing the screen here, and then I guess we can see if we have any questions that have popped up. All right, so question here: why did you decide to write this story? Well, I came across this story. I knew nothing about this story when I was learning American history, and came across it when I was doing my research on a prior book that was about a biography of the last bare knuckle heavyweight champion, John L. Sullivan. And one of the men that he fought in the ring, it was mentioned that he was a veteran of the attack on Canada. And I did a double take. I was like, what invasion of Canada are they talking about? And the more I learned about this, it was just this unknown story that I had never heard of from American history. And I'm always interested in Irish American history based on my lineage. And the more I sort of pulled that string, the more fascinating the story became. There have been a number of books that have been written about it, but from the Canadian perspective. Not one had been written about it from the perspective of these Irish Americans and what was really motivating them to undertake what we think is this, sort of crazy expedition. And I think, trying to unearth and start this story, the book starts with that right in the middle of the Great Hunger with the Young Ireland Revolution, and try to give an insight to, what sort of compelled these men to undertake them, to undertake these attacks. And so that was sort of the angle that I wanted to come in at it with. Another question. So what was important about San Juan Island that was worth that many forces on both sides for so long? So this is another area where there was just these border disputes that were happening between Great Britain and the United States that lingered well into the 1800s. So you had in the 1840s, they finally would set the border along between Maine and New Brunswick. And then, as migration moved westward, it took, decades and decades to go on. You may remember the slogan 54-40 or fight that was during James Polk's administration about where the border was going to be between Canada and the Oregon Territory. So there's all these disputes that are still going on in the 1850s. And even though in Puget Sound they had laid a border somewhere, San Juan Island was still this, is the biggest island in that chain out there that was still in dispute. So everywhere along the border had this potential of being a bit of a powder keg, and it was just considered that the Hudson's Bay Company, which was a very big commercial enterprise, having an outpost on the island was really the big economic driver at that point. But it really was this geopolitical standoff too, about just trying to establish border rights and not having one country sort of take it over. So it was obviously the British are the ones who send the warships there. The Americans are the ones they'll send 500 forces, and actually General Winfield Scott will be dispatched out there. He's the biggest name there, and I think Pickett's Charge, I think, is actually stationed out there, another name. But it's partly again this commercial impact of the Hudson's Bay Company, but then also just these longstanding border disputes everywhere along the Canadian border between the two countries. Another question, is there a list of men that fought with O'Neill? So there's not a standard register anywhere. It's very diffuse, a lot of the research that is out there. So in researching the book, I had, obviously you can go into a lot of contemporary newspapers of the time. There are archives that are kept at Villanova University and at the Catholic University as well, and a lot of scholarly research that's gone into it. So in a way, it's going into these different sources of membership roles in the Fenian Brotherhood to try to identify, oftentimes this question will come up if someone had an ancestor that they're trying to see if they were involved in the Fenian Raids or not. So it's really going in and trying to search through those archives based on a known name rather than, all right, here's a muster of all the men who were in a particular regiment. So for O'Neill's men who do this invasion in Buffalo, so O'Neill is sort of the head of, they would call the local organization circles. So he was the head center of the circle of the Nashville chapter of the Fenian Brotherhood. So you can find, perhaps men who are a member of these circles. Joining O'Neill in this invasion are circles from New Orleans and Louisville and Nashville. Those were the main thrust of where the men came from. And then you also had a lot then just who were members from Western New York as well. So we know the names of a lot of the leadership, the Fenian Brotherhood. We know the names of some of the leading military people as well. The rank and file, really, again, you have to go in looking maybe for a particular name to see if they're a participant or not. All right, so it looks like that's all the questions that we have there. Yep.
All right, so thank you again so much for everybody for attending. We really appreciate it. If you missed any portion of this lecture, we will make this available for patrons to watch. If folks want to go ahead and review or share it with your friends, you're welcome to do that. Thank you, Chris, for giving your permission for us to record that. Have a great rest of your night, everyone. So,
thank you.